It's the Opperman Report. Join digital forensic investigator and PI Ed Opperman for an in-depth discussion of conspiracy theories, strategy of New World Order resistance, high-profile court cases in the news, and interviews with expert guests and authors on these topics and more. It's the Opperman Report. And now, here is investigator Ed Opperman.
Okay, welcome to the Opperman Report. I'm your host, Private Investigator Ed Opperman. You can find me at Opperman Investigations and Digital Forensic Consulting, either through my website, emailrevealer.com. You can just email me at oppermaninvestigations@gmail.com. If you like our show, be sure and check out our Patreon. All the content that you hear Monday to Friday, AM, FM radio, we put up on the Patreon with ad-free. We cut out all the ads. And, of course, our archives, we got about 1,700 hours of content on Spreaker.com. You go to Spreaker, look up Opperman Report. It's free to sign up. You get an email notification anytime I put up new content. There's a chat room. And I do a live show there every Friday night exclusively just to the Spreaker audience. And our guest today, former LAPD intelligence officer Mike Rothmiller. We've done about 5 shows with him previously about Chappaquiddick, about his different books, and he got a new book out right now. It's one of the most popular topics we've ever covered on the show, too, is the murder of Marilyn Monroe. And Mike's book is called Bombshell, The Night Bobby Kennedy Killed Marilyn Monroe. Mr. Mike Rothmiller, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Thank you so much for coming back. Remind the audience, though, who is Mike Rothmiller?
Well, I was with LAPD for 10 years, and during that time, I worked patrol. I was a patrol training officer. Then I became a sergeant. I was a patrol supervisor, watch commander. I worked a tour of Vice, and some of that was in Hollywood, which was very bizarre. And then the last 5 years, I worked LAPD intelligence, which we looked. Well, we didn't. We looked at a lot of people, but primarily we gathered intelligence on some mob guys, politicians, entertainers, you name it, and we did our own investigations. And within the 5 years that I was there, since we only gathered intelligence, the 70 detectives in there, we never made one arrest, period. Because the chief said, I don't want any arrests because that means court and the possibility of the secrets coming out. So all we did was gather intelligence. We didn't have boundaries. We could go anywhere. I was in Mexico City several times. One guy was in Russia. Another fellow went to Japan because of the Yakuza and so forth, and it was all undercover. Nobody knew what we were doing. And we also worked joint operations with the CIA, FBI intelligence, the Mossad, foreign intelligence from a number of countries. So that's what we did. And it's something that people don't expect out of a city police department, but it was a large department, and that's what the chiefs of police were doing since 1932. And when I was there, we just continued that. So I left the PD. I went into private business. I was in business with some major country western stars. I became a TV reporter, and then I had my own television series on ESPN. And I ended my corporate career directing 3 divisions for Sony Electronics in the Western Hemisphere. And during that time, I've written over 30 books now. So that's my background. Yeah,
and I really encourage the audience to go check out the archives on Spreaker.com, the past interviews with Mike. What a career. And some great stories, man, about working with these Colombian drug lords. Was that a Mexican drug lord? You know, was trying to bribe and pay off. All kind of great stuff, man. Great stuff there. And then you believe that, well, you don't believe, I guess you were there, you know, that a lot of this intelligence work was for blackmail purposes?
Oh, yes, sure. Because what the chief of police wanted more than anything was power. And this is not just the chief I worked under, but all of them prior to that. They wanted power. Just think of what J. Edgar Hoover did. A lot of people know about that, how he blackmailed, for a better term, and extorted politicians so he kept his job. That's exactly what the chief of police was doing. Matter of fact, Hoover would have been proud of some of the things that we pulled off, you know. But that's what we're doing. It was all for power base, and it was for intimidating people, and it was for keeping friends friendly and converting an enemy to an ally. It's as simple as that.
Now, I guess it was about 7 years ago, the first time I had you on the show. Time flies. And way back then, you were talking about you were working on a Marilyn Monroe book. And so you've been working on this a long time. And the title gets right to the point. Bombshell, the night Bobby Kennedy killed Marilyn Monroe. Now, do you think a lot of people would be shocked to hear that?
6 or 7 years ago, probably.
Right.
Yes. Today, some people will be shocked. I think a lot of people go, yeah, it's what I thought. And the reason I'm saying this is because over the last, say, 20 years, because of various documentaries have been out on cable and so forth and various stories, a lot of information has come out from FBI documents, CIA documents regarding the Kennedys themselves, the three brothers, and what they were up to. And a lot of people have certainly changed their mind about thinking, oh, this is Camelot, they were all great guys, and all this stuff. Well, no, they had a dark side. And so I don't think a lot of people would be shocked. I think I know from talking to people and other interviews, the book fills in the blanks. A lot of people had questions, and pieces of the puzzle were missing. The book provides those pieces to the puzzle and completes the story.
And I guess yours is different because of all the first-hand documents you got a hold of, right? Yes,
I'll give you a rundown on that. Like I said, LAPD Intelligence did their own investigation on Marilyn Monroe's death, so I had access to that. And also, going back years before she died, they were maintaining intelligence files on the Kennedys, their extended family, Marilyn Monroe, Peter Lawford, all the people in Hollywood and so forth. LAPD Intelligence was doing that. And that, again, was for the benefit of the chief. Before John Kennedy even became a senator, he was close friends with Captain Hamilton, who ran LAPD Intelligence. And when he would come to the West Coast, or his brothers, or all together, they would a lot of times come under assumed names. And Hamilton would set up a suite for them in the Biltmore Hotel or wherever they wanted to be under an assumed name. And he would also supply anything they needed, mainly females, alcohol, and so forth. Mm-hmm. So Hamilton was the chief, the captain of LAPD Intelligence. And I read everything that he had in there and all the intelligence documents, surveillances of the Kennedys when they came out, and so forth. There was also a guy that I dealt with named Fred Otash. Fred became an informant of mine, and Fred was the person who planted the wiretaps on Marilyn's house and on Peter Lawford's house. He also installed bugs in both their houses and recorded the conversations. Fred was first hired by the Teamsters. Jimmy Hoffa, one of his contacts, got a hold of him because he wanted information, embarrassing information on the Kennedys. So Fred was first hired by him. Then it quickly came that the CIA hired him, the FBI hired him, and LAPD Intelligence hired him, all for the same information. And Fred told me what he was doing. It was interesting that he gave very little information to the Teamsters, to Hoffa, because he said Hoffa was a hothead and he didn't trust him. And then he said he parsed down information, gave a little to the FBI, a little bit more to the CIA, but then he told me, I gave all my information to LAPD Intelligence. I didn't quite believe him on that, but that's what he said, and I asked why, and he said, well, because you guys are the hometown muscle. You could take me out of business real fast if you wanted to, where the other ones couldn't, or he didn't think they could. So you have that, and then within the massive files of OCID, which I discussed, I found a copy when I was going through the files one day of Marilyn Monroe's diary that was supposedly lost. I always thought it was lost. That's what I always heard, until I came across it within LAPD intelligence files. So what I did, I started reading it, and I took notes right at the time of passages, contemporary notes. I'd read it and I'd write it down. And I only recorded items that I knew what she was talking about. For instance, she said like Robert or John or Kennedy, the president, so forth. Peter, meaning Peter Lawford, and some other people. I took those notes down. When when she discussed or made a mention of something I didn't understand, I didn't write it down because it meant nothing to me. So, fortunately, I kept those notes all these years. Then, in the spring of '82, as an intelligence guy, we had openings to go into a lot of different places people normally couldn't. One was Hugh Hefner's house, the Playboy Mansion. We could get in there anytime we wanted. And so I took my wife and a friend and his girlfriend on a weekend to the Playboy Mansion because they wanted to see it, as most people would want to see it. So as we were going through it, the guy who's head of security had them, and I was just tailing along because I'd been there many times. And then I heard a TV in a small anteroom that we stopped by, and I heard it playing. That was kind of odd because it was early in the morning on a weekend morning, and I walk over and I look in, and I see this man sitting there, long hair down to over his ears, maybe down close to his shoulders, and he's watching TV, and he turns and looks at me, and I'm staring at him. I'm thinking, God, he looks familiar, but I couldn't place him. Then it clicked. It was Peter Lawford, but he looks horrible. He looked horrible then, very wrinkled, very decrepit, and so forth. And he just looks back at the TV, so I spoke to him for a minute, and he was just either on drugs, alcohol, or combination. He was just loaded. And so I took my card, my business card said LAPD Intelligence, shoved it in the shirt pocket, hoping that he would find it someday and maybe call me. I didn't have a lot of hope for that. But anyway, I brought my wife in quickly, and the friend said, hey, it's Mr. Lawford. He just looked, nodded his head, and went back to TV. So anyway, about several days later, I'm in the office. There's a message that a Mr. Lawford called, and I went to a payphone, and because you got to remember, we didn't have cell phones at the time. So I went to a payphone, and I called him. And he kept asking me during the call, I said, who are you? How did I get your card? He didn't remember anything at the Playboy Mansion. And then it was curious because he said, are you CIA? And I didn't mention anything regarding intelligence or anything to this point. I said, no, I'm not. I'm LAPD. He says, okay. And he talks a little bit more, quizzing me. And he says, are you sure you're not the CIA? I said, no, I'm not the CIA. So anyway, he wanted to know why I would like to speak to him. I said, well, there are just some old questions about old Hollywood I'd like to have cleared up, and I think you can do it. I never mentioned Marilyn or the Kennedys or anything at that stage. So he thought for me, he said, okay. And I said, where would you like to meet? And generally what I did with people like that was nervous. He's talking CIA. And I said, well, let's just meet out in the park. By the Playboy Mansion, there's a public park. And he said, okay. We set a time and date, went there. And I'm waiting, and I think he's going to be a no-show. And so finally, I'm ready to leave, and I see him walking in the park very slowly, very cautiously, looking around, turning, so forth. And so I approach him, and he didn't recognize me. And I said, I'm so-and-so, LAPD Intelligence, we spoke. He said, okay. And I said, well, let's have a seat. There's a bench there. So we sat down, and he says, well, what do you want to know? And I just started quizzing him on the past to test his memory. And also I wanted to see if he was under the influence of drugs or alcohol or anything, which he wasn't. And so he was accurate on all his past memories from prior to Marilyn's death, after, and so forth. So then I kind of got into it, and I said, yeah, would you, one thing I'm curious about is the story you told regarding Marilyn Monroe's death, what happened that night. And he looked at me, he was kind of shocked, and he thought for a moment, and then he starts down the line of the story that was scripted for him by LAPD Intelligence back then. And I just stopped him. And I said, wait a minute, that is BS, and you know it, because I know where that story came from. And he was kind of indignant then, and he stood up, and I thought he was going to walk away. And I stood up next to him. I said, now listen, I want to tell you some things you don't know. I said, your phone and Marilyn's phone were bugged. Your house was bugged as Marilyn's house was. I said, I've heard some of the recordings. I've read the transcript. Fred Otash told me everything that he did. And the reason I mentioned Fred is because Peter originally hired Fred to bug a room in his house. So when he had meetings in that room, he could excuse himself, go to the next room, and listen to see what the people were saying about the meeting. So he knew who Fred was. And he just kind of got more irritated, and then I found, okay, this is it. It's going from, I've got to take it from an interview, just chatting, to an interrogation. So I got in his face real fast, and I started telling him, basically, I don't want to hear any more of this BS. I know what happened. You don't have. I just want you to tell me the truth. I don't want to hear that story, that made-up story. So he just looks at me, and then he sits down, and he just sits there on the bench for a moment, and he cradles his face in his hands, leans forward, and I sat down next to him, and he just, in a soft voice, says, what do you want to know? And I just said the truth. And so that's when he started out. He told me the truth, what actually happened that night when he picked up Robert at the airport. They went to Marilyn's house. They had several conversations back and forth, and how Robert called the White House from Peter's house regarding the meeting they had in the afternoon, and then they went back later at night. And I asked him, who was there at night when you got there? He says, well, nobody was there at night. It was just them. And he went into detail about how Robert got in an argument with Marilyn, and it became physical, a pushing match. And he pushed her down, and how they went, both of them, through the house searching for things. And I said, what were you looking for? And he says, well, anything that linked her to the Kennedys. And some people said they're just looking for the diary. He never said they're just looking for the diary. He just said they're looking for anything that linked Marilyn to the Kennedys.
And this was just Robert and Peter there at the house?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. And so as they're going in, after a while, this is really heated, and they're screaming at each other. So Peter was trying to keep everybody calm, at least get their voices down, because he said Bobby was getting violent with Marilyn. And so he takes her into the living room. He sets her on the sofa, and they're talking. He's trying to calm her down, and he says Robert was just gone. He said, I don't know where he was. He was somewhere in the house. So he said he finally got up and went looking for him, and he found him in the kitchen, and he had a glass, looked like just water. It's a clear glass. The water, he assumed it was water, was clear, but he had a spoon in it, and he's mixing it. Now, I asked him, said, well, why do you mix a glass of water? He says, well, I thought he put something in it. He put something in it, which made sense. And I said, was there any color in the water? No, it's clear, blah, blah, blah. So I said, then what'd you do? He says, well, then Robert took the glass out to Marilyn, and he followed. She was in the living room, and he gave her the glass, says, here, drink this, you'll feel better, and help calm you down, so forth. And Marilyn didn't want it, and then he said he coaxed her too, said, go ahead, it'll calm you down. And he thought it was just a sedative. Well, could have been, but a very strong sedative of some type, or something else. And so she took a sip, she complained of the taste, but they coaxed her, drink it down, so she finally did. Robert takes the glass back, takes it back to the kitchen, puts it in the kitchen. So Peter says, I'm still there with her, and they talk to her. Then they start going through the house searching again. And he doesn't remember the length of time, but he said they were searching the bedroom again, and some other, he said he saw Robert put some things in his pocket that he found. I said, what did he find? He says, I don't know, but he put something in his pockets. And he says when they went back out in the living room, Marilyn looked completely out of it. Then, head's laying back, so forth, and she's seated on the sofa, and he looks at her, and he says, boy, she looks like she's really out of it. Well, what happened? So he said he finally walks up to her, and he touches her, and he looks at her face. She's waxing at that stage. And he was really concerned. He thought, I said, did you think she was dead? He said, probably, she could have been. So about the same time, he said, they hear a knock on the door, and he panics. And he said, Robert just grabs him by the arm and says, we got to go. And so they walk to the door, and he said he was positive it was the police because of the screaming that went on. He said he opens the door. There's two men standing there in plain clothes, and he says, we just walk right past them. They don't say a word. Robert doesn't say a word. Robert just says, we got to go to the airport. You got to take me to the airport. And they walk out, and Peter said, well, who are those guys? He wouldn't answer. He says, then I saw the two guys walk in, close the door, and they took off. And so quizzing him, I said, well, have you ever seen those men before? And or do you know their names or anything like that? And he says, well, no, the one guy I never saw. He says, the other guy, he looks real familiar. And so I start dropping some names on him. He says, no. And I said, well, do you think he was a cop? And he says, I think he was. I've seen him before in the past with Bobby and Robert. So I described Hamilton. He says, yeah, that's about the description. I said, was his name Hamilton by any chance? He says, that's it. He says, that's the guy's name. Once again, Hamilton was head of LAPD intelligence then and a real close friend of the Kennedys. And so now we see that the cover-up is starting to be made. Then after I wrote my first book in 93, a guy calls me, and I was out of the PD at that stage for, about 10 years. I've been doing television news and so forth. And a guy named Jack Clemens calls me. And I had no idea who he was. And I said, well, hi, who are you? And he said, I'm Jack Clemens. He said, I used to be a LAPD. I said, okay, that's fine. What do you want? He says, well, I read your book, and I saw a little passage about Marilyn Monroe. And he says, I was the first cop at Marilyn Monroe's house the night she died. I said, really? He says, yes. So he relays the story to me, how he got there, how he got the call, what he saw, the cover-up starting. And I said, okay, well, let's get together. So over the next maybe 2 or 3 years, I'm thinking, we had dozens of phone calls. He'd call me, and we got together for lunch quite a few times, and he related his story to me that he never told anybody else. He said, yeah, I've been interviewed in the past about this, and this is what I said, but he says, this is the information I've never disclosed to anybody. And so he disclosed that information to me, and what it did, it just absolutely sealed the conspiracy, because it involved Hamilton coming to him, the captain of LAPD intelligence, and ordering him to sign some documents that he didn't write, and so forth, photographs that were doctored of her in bed. And you may have seen them, or some of your listeners may have seen them, where there's one photo of Marilyn lying dead in bed, and she's holding the telephone receiver in her hand. There's another photo, shows her lying in bed, but she's not holding the telephone. And so it was staged, and so he got into all the other issues, the people that were there when he arrived, how it was being staged, how they were lying to him, and so forth, and how the PD was lying to him. And finally, when he would not go along with the story that was being put out by LAPD, they got rid of him. They set him up and got rid of him. The PD did. So,
wait, who's that? Hamilton?
Yes.
Okay.
No, not Hamilton.
No. Oh, that
got rid of Jack Clemens.
Gotcha.
Later on, Hamilton became, not long after this, he became the first chief of security for the NFL. And how did that happen? And I've got all the documents on it discussed in the book, how RFK called the head of the NFL commissioner, said, you need a head of security to keep the DOJ out of investigating the National Football League. And he says, oh, we do? And he says, yeah, and here's the guy you need is Hamilton, James Hamilton. So they hired him immediately to be the head of NFL security. So he was rewarded. The other fellow who was with Hamilton that night, he retired shortly after that, and he bought a huge ranch, which, he never had any money, but he bought a huge ranch right afterwards. And you start looking at some of the other people that were close. They were all rewarded. The person who wasn't rewarded, and he died, as Bill Parker, who was the chief of police then, and oversaw all of this, is because he believed that he was going to be appointed head of the FBI if JFK was elected president. So when JFK was elected president, obviously that did not happen because Hoover had too much on the Kennedys. He had more on the Kennedys than Parker did. So Parker was disappointed, and then eventually he died a few years later. But the book covers the entire build-up to it, what happened involving the mob, involving Frank Sinatra and everybody else with her, and then what happened that night, how the cover-up was conducted with not only with LAPD, but with the coroner's office, the people involved, their involvement, what they did. And then, it just, like I said, it fills in all the blanks that people have had before, and it does away with a lot of the past theories that I've heard and people have called me about that just were not true, certain things that happened.
Well, this is great stuff. I got a million questions for you. We're talking today to Mike Rothmiller, former LAPD intelligence officer. The book is Bombshell, The Night Bobby Kennedy Killed Marilyn Monroe. Now, Mike, you hear so often the story is that she died from suppositories.
Well, yeah, that's one of the stories I was alluding to.
Yeah.
That there's been all sorts of stories. I know a lot of the people that have written books about it, they, over the years, since the mid-'90s, they've contacted me.
Yeah.
And they wanted to know, so, well, tell me what happened. I said, no, I'm not going to tell you what I know. I'm just going to tell you what I wrote in my first book, which is all of 2 or 3 sentences. That was it, about her diary being there. And that was it, so I never disclosed anything else to them. And so I guess they decided, some of them, or all of them, that they had to come up with a conclusion, because you can't write a book about something, just leave it blank as far as what happened. And so I've seen things where LAPD intelligence guys held her down and injected her in the armpit, in the rectum, in the vagina. I mean, I've heard everything. And suppositories and on and on and on, and then enemas and you name it. I've heard everything, every conceivable, I guess, conspiracy theory that would be out there. And they said, what do you think? I said, well, if that's what you think,
Now, what about the incident at the Cal Nava casino? Yeah,
well, she was up there not long before her death with Sinatra, and Sam Giancana was there, and some other things. And what they're trying to do is keep her in line, because she was becoming a loose cannon, and pretty much everybody knew it. And so she wasn't quite sure. Matter of fact, I have notes from her diary regarding the Cal Nava when she was up there that are in verbatim in the book, as a lot of the notes that I took just verbatim out of her diary that are in the book. So, they being the people there, got her loaded with drugs,
right,
alcohol, or combination of that. It appeared that from her diary, she would, and other statements and other intelligence got, that she was probably raped at the time by several people. And so that was all part of it. But then Sinatra, he was there, and he finally had her booted out of there and sent back home. And she wasn't quite sure, even from her diary, she wasn't quite sure what was going on. And so that just tells us she was loaded in some fashion.
So wait, did the diary confirm there was a rape or not?
No, she questioned herself.
Okay.
She didn't know. It was just the way the statement was written in her diary. She wasn't sure exactly what happened, but she thought she had sex, but she just wasn't sure from her memory.
Gotcha.
So
now
she was loaded. Yeah.
You mentioned Frank Sinatra, right?
Mm-hmm.
How does he play into this?
Well, he was real tight with, as you know, a lot of the mob guys. He was close to her. He owned, some say the controlling interest, others say not, of the Cal Naval Lodge, which was probably was actually controlled by Sam Giancana, because Sinatra would have done what he wanted. And so that's what comes in the background. And then we get into we set the book up. We talk about what Hollywood was like at the time, the players that were close to her, the players that were close to the mob and her, and the Kennedys and so forth, because as you know, unless you were around, were old enough, maybe an adult during that time frame, you'd be now late 70s or 80s, you have no idea what the country was like and what Hollywood was like. So we had to bring that into it. And the people that were around her and that were dealing with and manipulating her, which Sinatra was one, we had to bring all of that in to provide a background for people to understand what happened and why it happened.
What about Joe DiMaggio? Did he become aware of this?
Well, there's no telling how much he became aware of, but he, after Marilyn's death, within hours or days of him learning it, he pointed the finger immediately at the Kennedys, because he knew what was going on at that stage with them, what Marilyn's involvement was with them. And he always thought, and always told anybody, that he thought they were responsible for her death. He didn't know the details, but he always thought they were responsible.
Now what about, like, immediately after the death? Tell us about the cover-up.
Well, that was rather extensive, because what you had was the cover-up being run by LAPD intelligence, which at the time, you have to remember, in the late 50s and early 60s, they had enormous power. They were, without question, the most powerful organization on the West Coast, put it that way. They could ruin lives. They could throw you in jail for nothing. They were, giving an example, when the mob guys would come out from the East Coast, even before they had airlines doing what is trains, the early guys, they would meet them at the train station, pick them up, take them to a motel or a warehouse or out on Mulholland Drive somewhere, beat the heck out of them, tell them never to come back or they'll kill them, and they take them right back to the train station, throw them on the next train back to Chicago, New York, or wherever they came from. And what was said is that they would do this to keep the mob out of L.A. Well, that didn't fly, because L.A. had its own mob. And what they were doing is they were just keeping for a better term, the homeboys employed and not having any competition. That's what it boiled down to. So that's kind of the background, how it started. LAPD intelligence had, like I said, they would always gather intelligence on anybody within power. So they had loads of intelligence on the mayor, the city council, judges, so forth, and on the coroner of L.A. County, because the coroner handled all the autopsies for L.A. City. And if they needed an autopsy to come out in a certain way, they leaned on the coroner. And the coroner at the time, Kufi, he had issues. He had a lot of issues that LAPD intelligence knew about, but the public really didn't. So he was amenable to do as they asked, and they had a chat with him, and he immediately assigned the autopsy on Marilyn to Thomas Noguchi, because Noguchi was the new guy in town, young coroner, just hired on, where Kufi would normally do the autopsies on the celebrity, because that's what he liked to do. Well, he kissed it off to Noguchi, and he told him up front, well, here we got it from LAPD. meaning LAPD intelligence, it was an overdose, suicide, blah, blah, blah. And so as I went through, that's how it basically came out. Noguchi was smart enough, and that's all Noguchi knew was what he was told. And so he says, yeah, it looks like a suicide. But what you have to remember, you're well aware of this, is that toxicology testing at the time compared to today was very primitive. And there were certain things they could detect. There are certain things, even today, different drugs and chemicals that they can only detect if they go outside of the standard protocol and give it to another lab and say, do you have the ability to test for X, Y, and Z? And they do. At the time, there were drugs that the CIA had, and it's got all the documents to talk about that in the book, that were undetectable, and that the Kennedys, JFK, was already authorizing it to be used to assassinate people and some other world leaders. And so the drug was there. He had access to it. Robert certainly would have access to it. And there was no test, no toxicology test that could detect it. So you have that. And then Kufi just basically goes along with what is told of the investigation and so forth, that it was a suicide. And he says, fine, I'm done with it. That's it. And it continues from there. And what happened is the LAPD intelligence pulled, the night she died, all of the telephone tolls from the phone company servicing Peter Lawford's house and Marilyn's house. All of those, which is interesting, they were immediately taken by Hamilton and given to Chief of Police Parker in Parker's office the next morning. And I know this happened because I spoke with Tom Redden, who became Chief of Police, about it, because Tom Redden was an assistant chief. He was in Parker's office when Hamilton brought in the telephone tolls. He says, here are the telephone tolls, here are all the calls Marilyn made to Washington, D.C., the Peter Lawford, here's all Peter Lawford's calls, from his house, Peter Lawford's phone, and so forth. And he gave it to him. And they looked at them, they discussed them, and Parker said, okay, I'll keep these. He put them in his personal safe in his office. So now I'll jump ahead to the mid-'90s when I did my first book, and I'm on an interview, a radio interview, and the other person on it is Tom Redden, Sam Yorty, who's the former mayor of Los Angeles at the time, and me. And so we're talking about a lot of things regarding LAPD intelligence and corruption and so forth. So after we go off the air, Redden asked me, he says, can I call you? I want to talk to you about something. And I said, sure. So Yorty says the same thing to me. Fine. So Yorty calls me the following day, and he says, can you tell me what really happened about Marilyn Monroe? I started getting into it a bit with him. And he says, okay. So why are you asking me? He says, well, Chief of Police says Parker wouldn't tell me anything. He just says suicide. He said, I didn't believe it. So I asked Yorty, because we had a huge file on him, intelligence file. I said, well, do you want to know about your intelligence file? He says, no, thank you. He didn't want to know what they had on him. So anyway, the following day, Tom Redden calls. And we're chatting, and he says, I said, he wants to know about Marilyn Monroe, too. And I said, well, what do you need to know? You're the Chief of Police and assistant chief, and for a while there. And he says, well, yeah, I know. He says, and then he related the story about being in Parker's office and so forth when the telephone tolls arrived. So he says, the day I became chief, he says, I don't remember if it was my first or my second call, but it was to OCID, the Organized Crime Intelligence Division. That's where I worked. And he said, the guy answers the phone. He says, a lieutenant, I don't remember his name. And he says, I asked him, hey, do you guys have files on Marilyn Monroe, the Kennedys, Peter Lawford, and so forth? He goes, oh, yeah, we have extensive intelligence files on them, dossiers. He says, fine. I want you to bring all those files to my office and be here this afternoon, like at 3 o'clock or something. And the lieutenant says, oh, sure, Chief, no problem. So Redden says that afternoon comes, and who walks in is a captain of OCID, and he says, I understand you want to talk to me, Chief. And he says, no, I don't want to talk to you. I want to read the files. And he says, well, yeah, that's what I'm here for. I just want to tell you, he was mistaken. We have no files on those people, no dossiers. And I said, well, you know that's a complete lie. And he says, yeah, I know it was. But he said, I couldn't prove it. The reason he couldn't prove it is because at the time we didn't have computers. And so everything was like in the library cards and the master index. And then it told you where to go find these hard copies of these intelligence reports, which there were probably 50,000 people in file that we had dossiers on at the time. And unless you understood the code, the coding of it, when you pulled out the file card, you would never be able to find the documents. And in many cases, you'd never find the extremely sensitive confidential files, because that was marked it looked like an error, an asterisk up in the upper right-hand corner of the file card. And the only people who knew the system were the guys who worked there. And so if the chief of police went there, he would never find anything. And it was designed that way. So I told him what the deal was, and he said, yeah. He says, I knew it was a cover-up. I knew OCID was behind it, but he says, I did not know how I could prove it. And so he went on being chief of police and retired and so forth. But so that's the background and what
well, Mike,
people have to...
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, we only got about 5 minutes left, so I wanted to ask you, what else was on those wiretaps that you read about? What else were they discussing?
Oh, well, they were discussing all sorts of things. One, a lot of it was just normal conversations that people would have.
Yeah.
Two was Marilyn, when she was talking to RFK and then JFK. They were talking about when they could get together again and see each other, and she would talk about how much she loved first Jack Kennedy and then Robert Kennedy, and how she did in fact believe that Robert was going to leave his wife and marry her, which, that would never have occurred. And it was just a matter of they wanted to keep her quiet about the affair like all the other women. But the problem was she became a loose cannon, and they couldn't control her any longer. Like all the other women that JFK was around, like Judith Exner, who was the girlfriend of Sam Giancana, the Chicago mob boss. He was involved with her sexually when Sam Giancana was. And
she was also being wiretapped, right?
Oh, yeah. And what happened is when that broke up, because I saw the intelligence on it, is that JFK called her in Chicago, but he didn't realize the number was Sam Giancana's number where she was staying. And so the FBI had a wiretap on Giancana's home. So here they're listening to JFK talking to Judith, and it goes on. So what happened is Hoover gets a copy of that, and he calls RFK, and who's the AG, and says, hey, I want to talk to you about your brother. He comes over and says, yeah, here, if you want to hear this, I'll play for you, but this is what's going on. Your brother is sexually involved with this woman, Judith Exner, who also happens to be the girlfriend of Sam Giancana, and we have him on a wiretap. So at that point, RFK and JFK knew that they could never get rid of J. Edgar Hoover. So he just cemented his position with another president.
Just incredible information. I got so many questions for you. I know the book is going to be made into a movie soon, so maybe prior to that we can have you come back and fill us in with some more stuff. But in the next 3 minutes, what can you leave us with?
Well, that I said it clears up all of the loose ends. It gives answers to questions that people had in the past that were never answered. And it puts an end to a lot of the rumors that were out there about various issues regarding her death. And it also just brings to light what was really going on in the country at the time with the president, the AG, the FBI, and into police corruption at the highest level within LAPD. So it brings it all into play.
Well, let me ask you this now. These tapes, even the Exner tapes and the Marilyn Monroe tapes, they would be worth so much money today. How come no one's selling them?
Well, don't know why the FBI guy would not be selling them.
Yeah.
Get their hands on them. But LAPD, I know for a fact that when I was still there, we were going through a major purge of hiding things. We were going through files, we were destroying files, and so forth. And a lot of the recordings, I know one guy, he was tasked by the chief of police at the time, who was Daryl Gates, to take those recordings, the reels of recordings, the big tape reels, take them and maintain them somewhere, either at his house, storage unit, or wherever. But once they were out of LAPD's hands like that, then if they were subpoenaed, they can legitimately say, we do not have any tapes, recordings, transcripts, or anything within our files, because they weren't in their files, they were at some guy's house. So I know one guy in particular who had some of them. He passed away probably 3 years ago. I had some people, when I heard that he passed away, I had some people go to his widow and say, hey, do you have any documents? We know his story. She says, oh, yeah, I did. And they said, what do you mean? She says, well, we went to the attic, and he had boxes up there. A lot of things said top secret on it. He had a lot of recordings, just the tapes. And we said, well, what did you do? She says, well, I had them all thrown away. So.
Mike, we're out of time, man,
Yeah.
but you always bring the goods. You always bring the goods every time you come on the show. We're talking to Mike Rothmiller, Bombshell, the night Bobby Kennedy killed Marilyn Monroe. Keep an eye out for the movie. There's going to be a movie about this soon. Book's been nominated for Pulitzer Prize. Congratulations, Mike.
Thank you.
Talk to you soon, brother.
Sure. Take care.
Good night.
Thank you.